Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph, a organizational behavior scholar interested in all the things that we tend to think and feel that get in the way of our doing and saying things the way we want to, or help us do and say the things in the way that we want to. Today, we're going to be continuing our series on psychological safety, and we're going to move to the team level. So in the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how do you create psychological safety for yourself internally? How do you build psychological safety in a duet or dyad, taking the example of setting boundaries? And now we're going to be diving into Amy Edmondson's wonderful work from the book, The Fearless Organization. And specifically, we're going to be using something she calls the leader's toolkit for how do you create psychological safety on your teams. But let me start with a story. When I was 29, I was offered the job of being the CEO of a small public policy consulting firm called Bowtech Analysis Corporation. And the founder and owner of the organization was a wonderful public policy analyst named Mark Kleiman. And Mark and I had met because I was working at the Kennedy School of Government, doing research on smoking behavior and policy. And as in the real world, apparently smoking behavior and policy research proved to be a gateway drug to getting interested in marijuana and heroin and cocaine policy. And that was Mark's area. So Mark had the optimistic illusion that if you were smart and capable, you could kind of do anything, including managing other people. And so he thought he would appoint me to be the CEO of his consulting organization. So I certainly had good intentions, and I certainly like to think I did many things well in that job. But one of the many things I did not do so well and was not qualified for and didn't know how to do was run really effective meetings. And I'm sure you have all been in meetings like this. The painful thing for me is I was the one who was supposed to be running a good meeting. And you know that moment when you've been in a meeting for 10 minutes or something like that, and nobody really knows what is the meeting about and what are we trying to actually accomplish? And ideas are kind of floating around like little balloons and not tied down to anything. And suddenly someone asks, hey, what are we actually trying to do here? And, that horrible feeling, your stomach kind of drops and like you realize you have no idea, except was way worse for me because I was the chair of the meeting and I really realized I had no idea what exactly we were supposed to accomplish in that meeting. I knew we had to have a conversation about part of our contracting process, but I didn't really know how to say, like, this is the goal of the meeting, this is the process we're going to use to get there, et cetera, et cetera. So fortunately, I stumbled upon, maybe I asked around, the amazing work of an organization called Interaction Associates, and also the work of David Sibbett, who's a graphic facilitator. And Interaction Associates had revolutionized the work of meetings many years ago, 30 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, by having the radical idea that for each section of the meeting, you should know what you are trying to accomplish, and you should specify the goal, and you should specify the process you're going to use to get to the goal, how much time you're going to spend on it, and if needed, the decision-making process, how were decisions on that topic going to be made? So to support us in working at the intersection between the leader's toolkit step of setting the stage and something extremely practical, and that is meetings, because we often as team leaders need to run meetings. The readiness goal this week is ready to identify and name one key decision that will be made in the meeting and how. So, what is the decision and how is it going to be made? What do we mean by being transparent about how the decision is going to be made? That simply means, what is the decision-making process? So what I learned from Interaction Associates is decisions can be made by a vote. So are we going to have this criteria, this set of criteria, or this set of criteria? Let's vote. So majority vote. Another decision-making process is consensus agreement. Everybody has to agree on those criteria. A third type of approach is say that I'm going to get input from everybody, think about it, and I by myself will make the decision. A fourth is that there'll be some sort of ranked order voting. And a fifth is a recommendation will be made by the crew in the meeting at that moment to a smaller group who is going to decide. What's really interesting about this is different kinds of decisions tend to appear to have different levels of legitimacy. So generally, people tend to think of decision-making that's more inclusive as more legitimate, but often that's just not possible given time constraints. So, James, I'm pausing here because I was thinking your comment from earlier might be fun to pop in here if you felt like saying it.
Yeah, what we were discussing before the episode started was this method of saying how the decision will be made out loud is what I think of as a little bit of a paradigm tester. And I see these in other things as well. But basically, if you have to go and say out loud, I'm just going to make the decision by myself. And that feels really uncomfortable to do. Like if naming what is going to happen makes you really uncomfortable to do socially, that suggests it's probably a bad process.
Yeah, that is great. I love the move that you've named there, James, of once I discuss it or name it, then it becomes critiquable and challengeable. And I think that's part of the continuum of psychological safety, which is the more that we can surface things and the more they are allowed to be critiqued and discussed, generally that's a marker of greater psychological safety in a team. I don't want to naively imply that it's always good to use the most inclusive method, because almost always the most inclusive method of decision making takes longer, and that may not always be possible. It is also not always desirable. There's often contexts where one person is responsible for the final outcome and therefore has to make the decision and live with the decision, and especially take the heat for the decision. In that case, unilateral or solo decision making may be desirable. So this electrified me because all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, I can figure out what the goal of the meeting should be. No problem. Or that section of the meeting. So, for example, we need to hire a new secretary, or we need to hire a new contract researcher. What are the criteria that we are going to use to select that colleague? So the goal of that section of the meeting could be agree on the criteria for hiring a new secretary, or the criteria that we will use to hire a new contract researcher. So it's not really complicated, I thought, until one day I was trying to apply my newfound skills, having diligently taken the Interaction Associates meeting facilitation course. And I got to the part where we were going to where I thought it would be good to say, how are we going to decide on the criteria? And as the person who was responsible for making that decision, I thought a good way to do it would be I would get input from everybody and then I would decide. And I kind of went down my little list of different decision-making processes that Interaction Associates had given us in our meeting materials. And I saw seek input and make unilateral decisions. Well, not entirely unilateral, I guess. So I said, this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to get input from all y'all, and then I'm going to decide. And then there was really a lot of silence in the room. And fortunately, I think I had the emotional intelligence to realize like something was not going well and, said, hey, what's up? Or anyway, people were like, no, we're not really comfortable with you unilaterally deciding. We'd really prefer this level of input. Like, could we vote, or could we do this, or could we do that? As the chief executive, I still had to decide whether I was going to agree on that decision-making process, but at least we discussed it. So, why have I told this extended story about meeting facilitation? I think meeting facilitation or meetings are an incredibly clear microcosm of how are we doing in establishing team psychological safety. So in the Leader's Toolkit, Amy Edmondson talks about three important things that leaders have to do. One is set the stage, one is inviting participation, and one is responding productively. And for today, I'm just going to be focusing on the role of setting the stage as the team leader, with the example of how do we set the stage in meetings. In her book, The Fearless Organization, Amy talks about really important things like how do we set expectations regarding mistakes or failures? How do we set expectations regarding uncertainty? And how do we set expectations regarding interdependence? And this is where I think a meeting is such a brilliant lens, almost like a microscope, on how each one of those are going. So let me just be really concrete here. So what are our norms regarding interdependence in a meeting? Has to do with who gets to decide when we move from topic to topic, or whose opinions are going to be heard on a topic. So as the meeting facilitator, if I set out a roadmap for the meeting, for example, we're going to focus on the topic of how are we going to select the new contract researcher, and the goal is to agree on the criteria, and the process is we're going to brainstorm some different criteria, then we're going to compare that to maybe a AI-driven search that we did about what are the typical criteria in our field for this kind of a job, what are the qualifications, what are the skills. Maybe we're going to compare the things we came up with our own selves with what AI came up with, and then we're going to have a next step in the meeting where we're going to narrow that down to, let's say, 5 criteria in each area, these qualifications and these skills. And then maybe we're going to have some rank order voting to decide on our top 3 criteria. Although that sounds kind of mechanistic and even boring, the fact is each one of those steps in the process lets people know when is the opportunity for them to share their point of view, their voice. How are they interdependent with each other? Because they're going to be able to see, hey, I'm going to brainstorm on this. We're all going to brainstorm on this. We're all going to lean on each other's ideas. And while we aren't necessarily dealing explicitly with failure or mistakes in the agenda that we set for a meeting, The fact that we're being transparent about what are all the different steps that I, as the meeting chair, or if I'm the meeting chair and I've delegated to someone else to run the meeting using these steps and criteria, the fact that all that is discussable makes it, there's a spillover effect in how I can expect mistakes that I might make as I talk to be handled, or the fact that I was supposed to look up something regarding these criteria and I didn't look them up, and now I realize I'm not ready for the meeting and everybody knows it, is going to feel somewhat different in an environment where we're able to talk and discuss about those criteria and our process than in one where everything's undiscussable or implicit. So in the Leaders Toolkit from the Fearless Organization, Amy Edmondson doesn't use the word transparency explicitly in the table about the Leaders Toolkit, but the meta message of that table in many ways is all about transparency. And so I wanted to just share that it's kind of socially abnormal to preview or pre-brief or state what is your goal in a certain part of a meeting, or even to state what is your goal for a certain part of a conversation. And this is where I'd like to bring in one of the practices that we use widely in healthcare simulation, which is something called pre-briefing, which is when we're inviting someone into a space to do some experiential learning, whether it's an in situ simulation in their own emergency department or their own intensive care unit, and they're working in a bay that they work in every day, or whether they're coming to a simulation center like the one that I work at. We, the learning leaders, often spend some time to let them know what they can expect in terms of what is the learning going to be like today? Like, what's the process? Are they going to be encountering role plays? Are they going to be encountering actors? Are they going to be encountering mannequins? Is this going to be a skills-based training? In order to help our colleagues engage in learning and try and err at the edge of their expertise, one of the things we've learned is we have to do our best to try to create a safe container for learning. And one of the aspects of that is being clear about expectations, just as Amy Edmondson suggests in the Leaders Toolkit. The other thing we think a lot about in pre-briefing is the fact that although learning looks like or we often think of it because we all went to school to do it, a solo individual cognitive activity. It's me thinking, it's me trying out new things, whether I'm learning a new equation as a 7th grader, or I'm learning how to manage placing an intraosseous line as an emergency medicine resident, or I'm learning how to do a primary assessment as a nursing student, or I'm a team leader who's learning how to organize a team using an algorithm like name, claim, aim. In all those cases, how I learn that, I'm interacting with the other learners around me. I'm interacting with the facilitator who's trying to help me learn. And how I feel about those relationships, how at risk I feel for being shamed or humiliated, or how exhilarated I feel about the opportunity to try and make some mistakes without hurting any patients because it's simulation. That's in part largely determined by how the relationship between the learning leader and the learners plays out. And so that is part of what we are setting up when we are team leaders. We're letting people know, how are we going to respond to mistakes that they make? Am I going to see those as a growth opportunity, as Carol Dweck notes in her growth mindset versus fixed mindset research, that mistakes give us cues about what is the edge of our expertise and how can we improve. And I, as the leader setting the tone for my team, can let people know that's how I see mistakes. They're puzzles and they're interesting. They're not a crime. So as we think about how do we set up meetings for success as a team leader, or maybe you're just the meeting chair or the meeting facilitator that day, or the one who called the meeting and needs input from people. I'd just like to highlight that clarity about where you're heading is excellent. And something as simple as the goal of this part of the discussion is X will make a really big difference, even if you're unclear about what process is going to get you there. But one of the things I think we tend to overlook is the fact that there are often trade-offs in meetings as well. So last week we talked about the painful quality of trade-offs as an individual when I make a choice to set a boundary, because it's likely that I may either lose a little bit of my relationship with the other person, or I may lose a little bit of the relationship with myself if I don't stand up for what I think is important. At the team level, there's often trade-offs between how quickly we move through a meeting, because it's much easier to move quickly through a meeting if certain people in the meeting or the meeting leader is able to make unilateral decisions and you don't have to collaboratively decide. But that's a trade-off between inclusion and efficiency. Another typical kind of trade-off in the meeting is between, again, efficiency and comprehensiveness of how many things we consider. And so in setting the stage for psychological safety that supports positive performance in a meeting, that relies on our learning from each other and learning from information that we're digesting in the meeting, anything we can do that helps us be clear about those trade-offs can often help, because otherwise people feel either a lot of anxiety that if they don't speak soon enough or they don't get their idea out there, it's not going to be included and it won't be part of the decision. Or they may feel some resentment that decisions are being made about things they care about quickly and without their input. And naming and discussing what are those trade-offs and why they've been made can often make it much easier for the team within our meeting to share information or agree to move on and feel okay about it. So this week's workout of the week comes at the intersection of the conceptual ideas of how do we set the stage as a team leader, which includes framing the work. And framing the work includes how are we going to deal with mistakes or failure? How are we going to deal with uncertainty? How are we going to deal with or support interdependence? And in this episode, I used the example of the norms and guidelines we can create together to have a truly effective meeting. So the workout of the week this week is practice figuring out and stating aloud what will be the decision process for one decision in an upcoming meeting. So figure out and state aloud in the meeting what will be the decision process for one decision in an upcoming meeting. Curious Now is produced at the Center for Medical Simulation and directed and edited by James Lipshaw. If you like the kind of thing we've spoken about today, you might be interested in our personal leadership coaching service, which digs into how do you lead your teams, including in meetings. You might be interested in our leadership course starting in August for simulation leaders. Or you might be interested in our ALPS consulting service that helps healthcare leaders across the globe learn how to lead their teams in a way that builds connection, psychological safety, and team performance.